Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Jams and Tea Björk Retrospective. We're back with our fourth episode in this series, and of course, as you would expect, we are discussing the fourth proper Björk studio record, Vespertine, released in 2001, a record that turned 20 last year. And then we have Brett holding up the beautiful artwork for this record. And this is, I believe, one of the most beloved Björk records. It's kind of really aged like a fine wine. When I talk to Björk fans on the internet, and when I talk to people in general in the present day about what their favorite Björk record is, I would say Vespertine is the one that's most frequently cited, which is interesting because while, of course, this record did do really well when it came out, it kind of represents, I think, the first record that was really made after the sort of peak era of Björk's popularity, and it kind of signaled a shift with Björk away from, not away from pop music necessarily, not away from the world of pop, but this is a noticeably more insular record. It's a record that is more defined by its minimal techno textures and a shift away from the kind of pop bombast that kind of defined that peak era of her music that we talked about in the previous episodes of this series. And I think a big part of why that was is that Björk's, we kind of talked about in our Homogenic video, we talked about the kind of saturation of Björk, like the extent to which Björk had become such a big name, such a huge star in pop music and alternative music and the 90s music scene in general, that in a lot of ways the moves that she made were somewhat in reaction to her stardom as well. We talked about how Homogenic can be interpreted as a record about kind of rejecting the way that she was embraced and kind of lashing out against it. And Björk's popularity really kind of continued ascending to the point where one of the most significant moves of her career was her casting in the 2000 Lars von Trier film Dancer in the Dark. And this was very much one of those defining moments of Björk's artistic career, I would say. Certainly the biggest and most significant thing that she did outside of her music, although it is deeply tied up with her music, because if you've seen that film, you'll know it is a musical. You'll know Björk plays the lead and sings, and I believe composed and wrote all of the songs in the film. And this film was, of course, released in conjunction with the accompanying soundtrack record Selma Songs, which Jake and I did, I think, briefly discuss whether or not that should be its own video. And I think we eventually kind of decided against it, I suppose, for the sanctity of the core album focus of each video. But that is a release we can talk about if you want to. It's a beautifully ornate record that showcases a lot of what you expect from Björk in terms of the ambition of the songwriting, with a much more kind of classic sort of musical sound that befits the kind of movie that Dancer in the Dark is, or at least the kind of aesthetics that the movie wears. It's a very subversive film and kind of plays around a lot with musical movie conventions. But anyway, that was a big deal. Björk was nominated for an Oscar, I believe. And of course, you have the famous Academy Awards ceremony where she wore the swan dress. And it's maybe difficult for us to really appreciate now how bizarrely controversial that was. There was a lot of backlash against Björk wearing the swan dress to the Academy Awards. And I mention it, I emphasize it because obviously on the cover of this album, you have Björk kind of draped in that dress. You have that imagery evoked here. And I also lay all this contextual groundwork, much as I did with Homogenic last week, because Selma Songs and Dancer in the Dark and Björk's experience making that movie are a big part, again, the meta narrative behind a lot of what goes into this record. It's not something that the record is specifically focused on in a large part, but Björk's experience making Dancer in the Dark and her experience working with Lars von Trier was famously quite acrimonious. It was not a pleasant experience for Björk. It was an experience that I think most diplomatically could probably be described as mutually destructive, though Björk would state that it was much more destructive upon her than upon Lars von Trier, who's famously a very difficult filmmaker to work with. And so Björk was very disillusioned by the experience of making Dancer in the Dark. And I mean, you can even see when you watch that, it's a grueling film. It's not a difficult, it's not an easy film to watch at all. And you get a sense of Björk as an actress really putting a lot of physical and mental effort and energy into that role. And she was spent, right? And what's funny about that is when I think back to the kind of context leading up to Homogenic, it's kind of Björk was sort of in a similar state of oversaturation, of exhaustion, of being spent. And in 1997, she channeled all of that energy into making this huge, bombastic, caustic, and really rough sounding record that blew the image of Björk like up to, you know, IMAX scale. Whereas here, Björk is kind of dealing with a maybe not a similar, but sort of like an analogous sense of exhaustion through a different part of her career by doing kind of the opposite, by sort of retreating inward and making a record that Björk has described as being kind of like a refuge for her. Like the maximalism of her life, the intensity of what she was going through needed to have a kind of counterpoint at this point for her, needed to have music, needed to be a sense of solace, needed to be an escape for her. And this is tied in deeply as well with her relationship with the artist and her, I think, husband at the time, Matthew Barney, their relationship, and they had a child together, I believe, or children, I'm not even sure. That was an element of Björk's life that was very meaningful to her at that point in time, where a lot of her comfort and a lot of her security was coming out of that relationship. And you had a new side of Björk coming out, a kind of sensual side of Björk, a kind of more unguarded side of Björk compared to what we saw in the Homogenic era, that was a result of her kind of trying to escape all of the extraneous stuff that was caused, you know, kind of raining down on her, and just escaping into this sort of sensual world that she could create, that she could craft, and that her art could come out of. And it's worth noting as well that Vespertine is, I think, one of the Björk records, certainly up to this point, that had the longest gestation period. I mean, there was 4 years between Homogenic and this. And of course, while Dancer in the Dark was happening, all those sorts of other things, that gap wasn't purely because Björk was taking a break from making records. She was working on this album fairly steadily for a lot of that time. This is a record that is defined by an incredibly intricate minimal techno sound that is weaved in with a lot of these rich and sharp and sort of jagged music box textures. Björk had a lot of specific analog music box technology commissioned specifically to record this. And she spent a lot of time painstakingly putting the beats on this record together by hand herself. And so you have a record that is incredibly intimate by design. You have recordings where Björk is almost like evoking an ASMR sound with her kind of proximity to the microphone and the way that her vocals are mixed. And a record that sounds so kind of like glistening and sharp and wintry. And yeah, and that's basically how we get Vespertine in a nutshell. There are other elements to the way this sort of came together that we can touch on, but that I think is the basic context. But I've got 3 people here with me who love this record as much as I do, some of whom I would say probably love it even more than me. And so I want to hear from you guys, obviously, what does this record mean to you? But also, as I touched on before, a lot of people seem to think this is Björk's like high peak, and maybe you could speak to why that is, why people gravitate to this record so much now, why you guys gravitate to this record so much now, and what the appeal is of Vespertine in contrast to her previous records.
Yeah, so my relationship with Björk, I haven't finished her whole discography yet, but she's, quickly becoming a very favorite artist of mine. I've pretty much listened to everything from debut up to this point, Medulla. And I can quite comfortably say that Vespertine is my favorite album. Just kind of like doing my research and looking into the album, I found it actually really interesting how I didn't know that she was actually acting in that movie, and how this album is in some ways kind of a response to like everything that was going on with her in the public. She was kind of she was pretty much made a pariah for that whole like swan dress thing at the Oscars. So, and I guess with her relationship with Matthew Barney kind of coming into fruition, she kind of made this album as kind of like an escape for her and her partner to be in. It's a very like vulnerable and explicit album at points too. There's also very great production all the way around. I believe one of the producers on this is Matmos, and that definitely makes sense just because of like the micro beats that she's using. It kind of sounds like found sound stuff. Like I think I read somewhere that they use stuff like shuffling cards and like ice dropping into a glass to make some of the drum sounds on here. So I thought that was really, really cool. And just from just like from the first track, Hidden Place, it still has this kind of grandiosity from like the strings and like the harps that you get from Homogenic, but it's a little bit more somber, and it feels like crystalline. It feels like staring at like a glass figurine. It just has a very like, as you said, kind of like sheen to it, and it's very pristine. And there's also moments on the album where where they don't have any strings or harps, but it still sounds very interesting, like how on Cocoon it's pretty much just like this somber synth melody, and then it's guided by these like just tapping beats that pretty much guide it along. And Björk's performances throughout this whole album, as you said, it's almost like ASMR, like how she gets really close up into the mic, but it's really only to enhance that kind of sensuality that it has with the album. Because she talks very explicitly about sexual encounters that she's had with her partner in very weird details too, in some ways, but it kind of just adds to this really unique and like almost alien-like experience that like this is Björk's like romance album. Vespertine is kind of like her way of just taking her partner and kind of just holding them and kind of just escaping from everything that is kind of stressing her out in her life. She actually kind of mentions that in a couple of songs, like on the ending track Unison, which basically is about her pretty much kind of submitting to her partner in a way. She kind of refers to him as a gardener, and she kind of describes it in a way where it's not like completely tyrannical or like he's being controlling or anything, but rather that she's also an essential part and that she doesn't lose her identity. So in a way, the way that she kind of describes her relationship with Matthew throughout this whole thing, it's kind of her explaining that she's never really felt anything like this before, just kind of sensing vulnerability and sensibility from a man who doesn't really kind of look that way. I've never seen a picture of Matthew Barney, but she describes him as being like rugged and like having a beard and stuff, but those qualities in that he also has moments of vulnerability and being caring and sensitive too. And she kind of embraces that, and she's kind of as hesitant at times during this album during that, but eventually she comes to a point that or at least at that time, that she realized that she was making the right choice with him. And I guess that's what this whole album kind of encapsulates. It's just her way of kind of guiding through this relationship, the different realms that they explore together, both sexually, physically, romantically. And it's just a really brilliantly executed album, just from the production. It really guides itself. My favorite production throughout this whole album probably has to be on the song, I would say honestly on the song Harm of Will. Just the way that the strings kind of build on that song at the end, and the way that her voice is just soaring at certain points, it's just so like euphoric, and it just, you kind of get that sense that she's finally free after what happened, everything with her in the media last year. So, or at least at that time. So that's kind of like her just kind of like finally being free, but also at the same time kind of being closed off and kind of just wanting to be with her partner. So that's kind of what I got out of this album.
Yeah, there's like a sense of like symbiosis, of this idea of like coupling with someone as a way of kind of like filling in the kind of empty spaces and sort of gaps in you, and kind of like becoming sort of one with another person essentially is the kind of ultimate form of security. And that's, I guess, what the theme of unison is specifically, but it also, I think, carries across the entire record. It's the idea that by equally, sharing in each other's vulnerability and kind of revealing yourself to each other, like becoming naked, both in a literal and a kind of metaphorical sense, you
Yeah.
both kind of together acquire a strength that you might not have had alone. And the record to me is not just about like, the intimacy of being in a relationship and all that sort of thing, but it's about how the strength that comes from that coupling, from finding that yin yang sort of thing, is the thing that Björk needs at this time in order to function, in order to survive. And it's quite a powerful sentiment. I think it's quite a powerful expression of love. It's quite a powerful vision of love. And because it's Björk, of course, it's an idea that's expressed in some of the most esoteric and weird ways possible through the way that she writes, through the way that she expresses feeling. Yeah, you do get this sort of surreal aspect to it, this sort of alien aspect to it that Björk is wont to lean into. But that's, I guess, part of the charm of Björk as well as a writer.
It really does feel like, somebody from another world is experiencing these feelings of love for the first time, because the way she writes her lyrics is with such grandiosity, with such heightened emotions. It matches the music perfectly. And if I may, real quick, I have a bit of a story when it comes to how I discovered this song. Well, not really a story. Who I have to thank for me getting into Björk in the first place is the great Phil Elverum, because one of his songs, Voice in Headphones, one of his best songs, he's like, that song is all about how the song Undo makes him cry. And Undo is not one of the most lyrically complex songs on the record, but it is just so direct and heightened, all about giving yourself into love. And when you hear that fucking choir by the end of the song singing the chorus, it's not meant to be a strife, it's not meant to be a struggle uphill, it's the perfect form of validation of relax, this is the best relationship you've ever been in, these feelings are alien to you, or like these heightened feelings are alien to you, so enjoy them while they last, because these are beautiful, beautiful emotions. That's in my four-way tie for favorite Björk song, because of how incredibly well produced it is, but also just how fucking amazingly she sings it. This or Volnakura is my favorite Björk album, which both of these are companion pieces, especially because Vespertine is the beginning of this exciting brand new relationship, discovering all of these feelings of love and intimacy, especially with a track like Hidden Place. That song to me is one of the greatest songs about sex and vulnerability and love, and especially with those beats and that choir just coming in. I don't know if it's a choir full of people or if it's just Björk layering her voice on top of one another, but it really does sound like a Greek chorus, as the lead player Björk on stage is just delivering these soliloquies to herself, and then there's the Greek chorus just saying, yes, these feelings you are experiencing are real.
Yeah, I'd say the choir on It's Not Up to You is probably my favorite choir moment on this whole album. Just like when that comes on, it just feels so Christmassy. I don't know why. It just it feels like they're singing like a Christmas carol. It just makes me smile. But yeah, there's other little cool moments on the album, like the interlude Frosty. It's such a cool again, like crystalline, like music box sounding like little interlude. It's just so like celestial. It kind of reminds me, like, weirdly enough, of like a wood nymph like floating through the woods. It just kind of feels very like otherworldly and like supernatural. I think it's like a really cool way to even transition into the next track, Aurora, because it kind of also feels like very like kind of like you're staring at the northern lights. It just feels very bright and very shimmery. And then on Aurora, she kind of has this interesting story about how she fell on a glacier, and she kind of used this technique to put ice in her mouth to ease the pain of that. And she kind of uses that as like emotional catharsis to kind of like let go of past insecurities that she's had, just like how she had to do like in that moment. So that's another cool moment that that I really appreciate on this album.
I'm glad that Brett shouted out Aurora, actually, because that's one of my deep cut favorites on this album too. And we were talking about great choir moments. That the way that that song is structured and the way that that song kind of expands, like the way it starts with those like footsteps in snow, which is a sample that I think Björk recorded herself and that Matmos assisted in kind of like chopping up. It's a very Matmos thing to take a sample like that and then turn it into the actual beat of the song. But there's also like a subtlety and a kind of like abstraction to the way that it's used as well. It's not like this sort of conventional beat. I mean, Björk talks a lot about how when she was making this record, she worked with micro beats a lot. And specifically what she means by that is taking sounds and kind of like constructing like percussive rhythms that are intricately detailed on a level that is like almost beyond like the human hearing threshold in terms of distinguishing like elements, and working with sounds that are so like minute and small and like and little like beats and stuff that are so like, you know, granular that you can barely even perceive all of the nuance and detail in them. And the effect of that is something that you're not always conscious of when you're listening to the record. It just creates this sort of sense of incredibly sensory feeling while you're listening to this album. It's like having your brain massaged, or like, I don't even know how to describe it. And like when you think of a track like Frosty, for instance, and you think of that music box sound, it's not, what's great about it, it's not just how like beautiful it sounds and how lovely and gorgeous the melody is, and it's very lovely and gorgeous, but just the texture and the tonality of the music box. It has this sort of tactility to it. It has this kind of like real brightness to it, but also this kind of sharpness to it, the sense of like saturation in the sound, and it's really gorgeous. And Björk kind of emphasized how much she labored over trying to get these sounds to sound exactly this way. And as I sort of said earlier, sometimes it required like commissioning specific technology to be made to do that and make that possible. And it's kind of funny that the record combines like, you know, technology that is sort of you know, specifically designed on that level, with also like the fact that she was working with Pro Tools and the fact that she was working with the Sibelius software to compose a lot of this as well on her laptop. She's described this as her laptop album. So there is like, and that I think is another kind of detail that you can use to emphasize the intimacy of how this sounds as well, is that compared to the big sort of huge big name collaborations and bombastic sounds of those previous records, here you're getting a record that really brings you closer to Björk as a person than ever on like so many different levels.
Well, one thing I found quite interesting about this record and the approach that she has in comparison to her last album, Homogenic, and for anyone that might not be as familiar with Björk stuff, it seems all like whenever people talk about the best Björk album, it's usually a toss-up between Homogenic and Vespertine. And I can kind of see why, because they're similar just in the way that they kind of combine a lot of beautiful orchestration elements with electronic beats. But that's kind of where the similarities end, because this record, one thing that I found interesting about the background of it is that this was, at least the context was, this was made in kind of the rising popularity of things like Napster, more generally music downloading. And she wanted to make an album that was a lot more, like we said, intimate, almost ASMR-ish, and use instrumentation that is a lot more, I would say, clean and icy and kind of and like glassy. and not nearly as distorted and abrasive as they are on Homogenic, just so that in that file sharing era that, you know, the sound quality wouldn't diminish quite as much as it would on, you know, something that sounded a lot more distorted. And I think she just absolutely nails it in terms of that approach. Every single detail and arrangement on this record is just so meticulously crafted and just so beautifully put together. Like, for example, also one of my favorite tracks, Undo, which that has such a warm, nice keyboard sound to start it off with Björk's panned vocals. I also love kind of the little detail where she's singing with herself, you know, panned left and right, and one of the voices is like purposely kind of delaying words. I don't know exactly why she does that. It just seems like it's a very Björk thing to do.
I think it
And
like
it works so beautifully.
it emphasizes that sense of duality. I think that she's kind of going for this whole record, this idea of like, you know, being in simpatico with someone else. And I mean, parts of it is, you know, she's referring to a specific partner, but other parts of it's like another side of herself. And that's not, I guess, a new idea for Björk, but it really takes center stage here. I mean, this is a record like a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Homogenic is like an album that's sort of made up of dichotomies, like loud, quiet, beautiful, harsh, all these sorts of things. And here it's like, you know, you have these different sides of Björk within this sort of like more withdrawn, sort of introspective side of her. And she is like getting in touch with this sort of inner part of her, and I don't even know how to express it quite right, but it seems to me like a lot of the self-harmonizing that she does here, and also the use of the choral vocals as well, which kind of function sort of harmonically in a lot of ways as well, to kind of just emphasize melodies and stuff, like on It's Not Up to You, feel like they're there for that purpose. Also, I want to say, on the note of Undo, I just had a kind of revelation this morning listening to this, that probably is my favorite song on this record, which is like, it's just, it's really been hitting today. And I listened to this record a couple of times today, and it's really just, I'm in total awe of how well constructed that track is. I think in general, the first 5 tracks on this record are like one of the greatest golden runs of music in Björk's entire discography. It's just seamless.
My notes on the track Pagan Poetry, speaking of 5 tracks, it just reads genius. Like, I just listen to that song and I'm just like, yeah, this is one of the greatest fucking things of all time.
Yeah, Jacob, I think it's fair to say that you love it, you love it, you love it, you love it.
God damn it, that was good.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love him.
Yeah, I love him. No, like,
I love that fucking delivery so much. It's just so, like, because especially after, like, again, I think we talked a little bit about this in the last video on Homogenic, but you have like the noisiest, most abrasive song in Björk's entire career, Pluto, and then it just kind of slowly transitions to All Is Full of Love, which is a perfect goddamn lead into this record. And something like Pagan Poetry, you think of like the harshness and the bitterness and even sadness of tracks on Homogenic. This also, I think, carries a lot of those same fears and anxieties, but there's a big breath of relief. Something I was also thinking about when thinking about Dancer in the Dark, and like Björk having a difficult time, and with Lars von Trier, who sucks. It feels like a breath of relief, a sigh of relief after all of the abuses that maybe she had gone through on that set. That, like, it's not just about her meeting a new partner, but also I'm back in my element. I'm back in making this music. I'm finally free of all of this as well. Like, there is such like, a tranquility of like I'm finally back with some sort of peace and with someone I love.
Which I think is why it's significant that the record opens with Hidden Place, right? Because that, to me, represents exactly what you're saying, like the escape. And then, the rest of the record is the hidden place itself, represented through sound, the idea of like the solace and intimacy, the coupling, all that sort of thing you get all these different visions of it. And it's quite meaningful that, you know, from that intro, you know, we go to the hidden place, you go immediately into Cocoon, which is like the most like sexual song on the record, where like not only lyrically but also just like because of the way that she mics her vocals and the way the vocals are mixed on this track to feel like she's literally, her lips are on your ear and she's like whispering the lyrics into your face. And it's a very like, it's kind of discomforting experience, but also like, you know, it's striking. And I think it also like, you can see the seeds of some of the things that she would go to do on with Medulla in moments like this as well, but save that for the next video. But yeah, so anyway, that's kind of like the album in a nutshell, really, like immediately from those first couple of tracks.
I really love how like a lot of the like structurally you have a lot of, you know, chorus and big moments on this record, but they're not like grand or brash like they might be on something like Homogenic. They just like swell in. There's so many moments where something like the strings or the choir just like really gradually and takes its time to swell in and fade in and just blow you away. It doesn't even do that on every track. Like you said, Cocoon. I really love how, again, intimate and warm this song sounds. And it's one of the most minimal tracks too, which is kind of interesting considering it's the second song. The really clicky, soft percussion kind of reminds me of an album that I actually have not heard in full, but I've heard snippets of, and it's kind of notorious. But Dataplex, that album is just filled with the like super clicky, almost annoying sounds, but the way it's done here is just so delicate and warm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair to say this is one of the most, like, certainly up to this point, one of the most kind of sonically unified Björk records. Like a lot of the time, she makes a point to kind of veer between styles. And we did talk about with Homogenic how that was a more sort of consistent record in and of itself, but also like made up of sonic dichotomies too. Whereas here, like, this is very much a singular palette the whole way through. And Björk almost seems to make a point of emphasizing flow. Like I talked about with Homogenic, how like one of the things about that record is like some of the transitions between songs can be fucking jarring and it throws you around like a fucking dog with a toy in its mouth. Whereas this is like Björk makes a point of easing you between, you know, different sections and passages of this record, like Frosty into Aurora and all these sorts of moments, and the consistency of musical motifs like the music box, like the choir, the way that certain songs are structured, like Undo and Aurora almost have the same sort of structure in terms of how they're built up together. So it's makes for, I think, a more consumable and friendly experience as well, which maybe explains why so many people gravitate towards it. Jake, who couldn't be with us, I think was kind of devastated to not be with us here because he really loves this record. I think it's one of his favorite Björk records. But we can even see in the dichotomy between his feelings on Homogenic, where he's like, as he said last week, his least favorite Björk record, and this where he's like head over heels. You can see how, you know, these are two very distinct records that are made for two very distinct experiences. And whereas I gravitate to the bombastic sort of techno extravagance of Homogenic more so than this, I do also really appreciate the tactility and the beauty of what's going on here. I think that it's a record that I think has, the second half isn't quite as good as the first half, but you know, it's still a very holistic and beautiful experience. And there are lovely deep cuts like Heirloom and Harm of Will, which I'm glad that Brett mentioned, because apparently I just found out while researching this record that the lyrics to that song were written by Harmony Korine of all people. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah.
And I also want to mention as well, I try to make a point of mentioning like the accompanying art and stuff. One of Björk's most notorious music videos, the music video for Pagan Poetry, in which she uses footage of herself having real sex with Matthew Barney, and kind of it gets distorted and kind of layered with effects and stuff, and it becomes this incredibly like almost violent video in terms of like a violent expression of sexual power and sexual passion and stuff. And that video was famously banned from MTV because of the sexual content of it. So that's kind of like one of the most notorious moments of like extraneous media accompanying this record. Although I think from here on out, the kind of media accompaniment stuff wouldn't be as huge a part of Björk's music, not at least not until Biophilia, where it really starts to kick in again in that era. But yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that with every aspect of the way that this record was being publicized, with the art that Björk was creating here, she was fully putting that sort of sexuality front and center, to the point where it's almost like you get the impression that she's maybe even trying to make people uncomfortable and trying to like push at some of the taboos and boundaries of like what's acceptable in terms of displays of sexuality in mainstream media. She's very much, I think, really digging at those kind of boundaries, and that's one of the other things about the record that I think is exciting, and that also has also aged really well as the kind of boundary pushing she's doing here has gotten more and more sort of in vogue and fashionable. So yeah, it's a big part of why I think people love this album.
I would also say too, like Connor, you mentioned that like she made this album specifically for the file sharing generation, and I in general just love that she did that in general, especially because so many musicians were trying to prevent shit like that from happening, yet Björk, I think also why this album stands the test of time as well is because like she was still trying to think of like, okay, how is music going to be consumed in the future? She was really thinking about music distribution, and through her videos and through her songs, like she was still thinking about how do I push my art even further. And again, like Harmony Korine writing Heirloom also shows, okay, I'll work with a filmmaker who is pushing boundaries as well. This album in general, even though it's not as harsh and abrasive in moments or like grandiose as Homogenic, to me what it definitely shows is the expression of love in its highest form, even anxiety in its highest form as well. And the fact that Björk is just able to present these feelings so passionately, so brilliantly, without any form of stopping, even after Homogenic, which is considered to be a high point of her career, and then make something even better after that with all of these experimental moments of production and music box and wind chimes, and to have it sound that good live as well. Check out the live tracks. The Vespertine live album is absolutely incredible. I don't know, it feels like I'm word vomiting, but I adore this album with all my goddamn heart.
Absolutely. I think part of the reason why Björk gets compared to artists like Kate Bush and stuff is that they both represent this kind of vision of a female singer-songwriter who really front loads their passion in their art, and not just in a like typical sexual way that female singer-songwriters, musicians are expected to, but just like all kinds of passions and stuff, all kinds of exuberance, weirdness, like pushing at the edges of conventional taste and stuff. Like Björk was doing that for the new generation at the time, and the influence that her confidence in doing that and her success in doing that had, I mean, it's incalculable. Like it's still having as much effect and impact today as it was at the time, and in a lot of ways I can see an argument for this being one of her most influential records for that reason.
When it comes down to it, it's really just, in terms of albums that I've heard, probably the most beautiful and genuine expression of love put to tape. And also just like, and we've gone on about how beautiful the production is, but like, it's worth noting that this came out in 2001, as you know, well over 20 years at this point. God, 20 years, man.
20 years.
It's hard to think about that. But like, it doesn't sound like it's aged a day, because no one's quite making anything like this, but nothing here you could argue that something like Homogenic, like I wouldn't say it's aged badly, of course, but like there are moments that sound, very, very much of its time. Whereas this record, like if this were released today, it would sound revolutionary. So I can't even imagine hearing this back then and trying to make sense of what I'm hearing. But it's just all so beautifully composed and arranged, and the songwriting is on point throughout, that it doesn't feel jarring. It's just such a warm, in a way, approachable record, but also incredibly experimental in its approach. So yeah, it's just fucking incredible.
Hell yeah. All right. Well, I think that makes a good time to wrap up with our favorite tracks and ratings then. Connor, why don't you go first?
So my favorite Björk song in general is the closing track, Unison. Just an absolute incredible fucking tune. Just the essence of what makes Björk one of the best artists. I'm going to go with It's Not Up to You and Undo. Least favorite, 10.
Hell yeah.
My 3 favorite tracks. My favorite is Undo. I didn't bring this up, but Aurora I think is magnificent. I think it's striking. And also another underrated deep cut to me is an Echo of Stain, which is also just an incredibly, like, one of the best dream pop songs I've ever heard, I guess, if you can call it that. But I adore that song. And my least favorite, there is no least favorite to me. This is a 10.
Hell yes. All right. Well, Jake has this album at a 10. He hasn't given me favorite tracks and ratings though. I know August has this album at an 8, and Morgan hasn't heard this album, which is shameful. Brett's favorite tracks were It's Not Up to You, Hidden Place, and Harm of Will, no least favorite, and Brett gives it a 10. And my favorite tracks are Undo, Pagan Poetry, and Hidden Place, in that order. Least favorite is probably Sun in My Mouth, and I'm going to give the album a 9, which means that overall this album gets an average of 9.4. Homogenic got the same average that Post it. They both got 9.0, but this gets a 9.4, which makes it the highest rated Björk album quite comfortably in our series so far. And we will see what happens with the subsequent records. I think it's fair to say that with the next few records, we're going to be going into the wilderness a little bit, talking about Björk records that haven't been discussed as much as these golden era records. And I'm really looking forward to that. And I hope that everyone at home will be able to join us for those episodes too. But before then, let us know what you think of Vespertine, where Vespertine ranks in your favorite Björk records, in your Björk discography ranking overall. Let us know, is it your favorite, or do you think that it's overrated, or where would you rank it? What are your favorite songs, and what are your feelings and connections to this record in particular? Please let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. Both of those things help us an awful lot. If you really want to support the channel and go above and beyond, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can support the channel, get your name featured in the title crawl of every video on this channel, get priority comment response. And if you want to give us a recommendation for something to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. All right, everyone. As always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Reese's Puffs, peanut butter chocolate flavor.